Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar titled Lead-Based Paint Basics, an overview of New York City's requirements for building owners. This webinar is being hosted by the New York City office, the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation and Development's Office of Enforcement and Neighborhood Services, also known as ENS for short. My name is Phil Weitzman. I'll be your primary speaker today. I'm a senior trainer here within ENS, and several of my colleagues are joining us. Let's have them introduce themselves. Let's hear from Jesse Laufer, Deputy Director of the FAR Unit. Jesse, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here with you.
We also have two chiefs from the Code Enforcement Lead Unit. We are joined by Chief Curly Wyndham from the Lead-Based Paint Inspections Unit. Chief Wyndham, would you like to say hello?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
And Chief Joseph Ayub from the Lead-Based Paint Administrative Unit. Chief Ayub, would you like to say hello?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being here today.
All right, so before we get into the content of today's webinar, we just want to give you a quick tour of some of the webinar resources and features that we have today. Whether you've joined us on a desktop or laptop computer or on a phone, there are some useful features, namely what we see here, handouts and questions in chat. So the current view shows you what these will look like if you've joined us on a desktop or laptop computer. We've attached 5 handouts to this webinar that are all useful resources for you to refer to, and I'll be mentioning a few of these as we go throughout the presentation. For anybody who can't access the handouts or who is watching the recorded version of this webinar, all of these handouts are also available on our website. So they're easy to find on the website as well, but we've attached them to this webinar as a convenience for those of us joining us live. The other important feature is the questions or chat feature. This is how you can communicate with us during the webinar. If you have any questions about today's content, please feel free to submit those questions at any time. You don't have to wait until a designated question and answer period. You can also use the questions in chat to let us know if you are having any kind of technical difficulties. That's very helpful for us because it helps us realize if there's a problem happening with the webinar software. So please feel free to communicate with us about technical difficulties as well as any questions you may have during this webinar. Now, we do have a very large audience, about 280 people and climbing right now. So we will not be able to answer every question, but we will do our best to get to as many as we can throughout the presentation. Now, again, the current screen is what the webinar features look like if you join us on a desktop or a laptop computer. And here we see images of the webinar interface for mobile phone. As you can see, the features look a little different between Android and iPhone, but essentially it's the same thing. To find the questions and chat feature, you're going to look for a question mark, and to find the handouts, you're going to look at an icon of a folded piece of paper. At the end of the webinar, we'll mention this right now, we're going to push out a quick survey. If you can take a moment to let us know what you thought of the webinar, what you liked, how you think we can improve, we appreciate it. We always read your survey questions very carefully. And a video of this session will be emailed to every registrant for the webinar within about 24 hours after we conclude. So if you liked this webinar so much that you would like to watch it again, you'll be able to. And we will also be posting video of the webinar to our website within a week or so. And as of now, a previous version of the same webinar is already available on our website. So if you really want to rewatch just to catch something before we post the new version, you'll be able to do that as well. A quick disclaimer as we prepare to move into our main topic. This presentation is for informational purposes and does not constitute legal advice. This presentation is not a complete statement of building owners' responsibilities relating to lead-based paint or any other topic. So if you want sort of exhaustive, ironclad legal advice on these topics, we recommend that you consult with an attorney. We're providing a summary and a basic introduction to lead-based paint here today. And our target audience today is people who are new to this topic. So that's the audience that we have in mind, residential building owners and managers who are not already familiar with the city's rules. If you are more familiar with the city's rules, though, you are still more than welcome to stay. There is plenty to learn, and I'm sure that there will be a lot for you to get out of this webinar as well. Another part of our disclaimer is to specify that today's topic is New York City's Local Law 1 of 2004 as amended. That is the current lead-based paint safety law that applies here in New York City. In some cases, we'll be mentioning federal regulations, but mostly we will be focusing only on the New York City law. So there are other lead-based paint rules that apply depending on the jurisdiction that we could be talking about. But today we're focusing on New York City law because that is the law that HPD is enforcing. So again, the main point is that we're giving an introduction here, but every building owner is responsible for using their own judgment to build on what we share with you here in order to fully comply with all of the provisions of the law. So there's our disclaimer, and now let's take a look at all the topics that we will be covering here today. So we're going to start with a nice overview of the basics of lead-based paint. Then we're going to get into some individual topics in a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about practices to ensure that any work that disturbs lead is done safely. We're going to talk about the annual inquiry and investigation required in New York City. We're going to talk about the requirement to keep 10 years of records for all lead-based paint activities. We're going to talk about what to do when an apartment is vacant. We're going to talk about a requirement to test all units for the presence of lead-based paint by 2025 in New York City. We're going to review a recent piece of news, which was a change in the threshold for what constitutes lead-based paint, and talk about the effects of that change. We're going to talk about HPD violations and how to respond to them. And then towards the end, we will talk a little bit about exemption, the process of telling HPD that you have minimized or eliminated lead-based paint hazards in your units or in your building. And at the end, I'll give a quick guide to some additional resources for learning more. So that's what we have in store for us here today. All of the chapters of today's webinar are based on separate webinars. So if you haven't noticed yet, lead-based paint is a vast topic. So we're only getting started here today. If you would like to learn more, you can visit our website, www.nyc.gov/lead-based-paint, and you can watch an entire 1 hour to 90-minute webinar on any one of these topics that constitute separate chapters of today's introductory webinar. So again, we're really just getting started here today. If you're completely new to these topics, it's going to take a little time for you to get up to speed, and so this will be the beginning of your journey to better understanding lead-based paint compliance in New York City. Before we move any further, we'd like to get to know you a little bit, and so that we can understand our audience. So I'm going to take a moment here to send a poll out and just let us know which of the following best describes you. Okay, I see the votes are coming in. About half of us have voted now. About 2/3. About 3/4. And I'll go ahead and close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and let's see how everybody voted. All right, it looks like the vast majority of our audience are our intended audience for this presentation, which is building owners or managing agents and supers of buildings. And then some people fall into the other category. So again, we're going to be addressing the audience of building owners or managing agents and supers in this presentation. But for those of you who don't fall within that category, there's still plenty for you to learn, and we welcome you as well. Okay, and let's do one other poll. Have you attended one of our lead-based paint webinars previously? Okay, about half of us have voted. About 2/3. And we're getting up to about 3/4, and I will close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so thank you for sharing a bit about yourself in these two polls. And it seems that 3/4 of our audience is the intended audience here, which is people who are new to these topics. So it's great that you have come to join us to educate yourself about the lead-based paint compliance, and we welcome you. And as I've said, those of you who have watched a previous webinar, there will be plenty for you to learn as well. We're going to assume that our audience is new to these topics. So welcome everybody. Thanks again for sharing a bit about yourselves in these polls. So let's start by discussing lead-based paint basics. This part 1 is going to be an overview of some topics that we will go into more detail about as we proceed. The most basic and important fact about lead-based paint is that it is dangerous to children. That is why we are here talking about lead-based paint in residential housing, because young children's nervous systems and their brains are still developing, and lead-based paint interferes with that process. So the effects of lead poisoning on a child can be devastating. It can cause permanent, lifelong negative impacts. So when lead-based paint deteriorates, dust and paint chips will land on areas where children can ingest it. And children are at increased risk for a number of reasons. The first is that a child is more sensitive to lead poisoning than an adult. So the same amount of lead will cause greater harm to a child than it would for an adult. And in addition to that, children explore their environments through hand-to-mouth activity. So children are touching the floors that may have lead dust. They may be eating lead-based paint. They may be putting their dusty hands into their mouths. And so they're going to ingest more lead in a particular environment than an adult would in that same environment. So recognizing all of these risks, lead-based paint was banned for residential use by New York City starting on January 1st, 1960, and by the United States starting on January 1st, 1978, 18 years later. These two dates are very, very important for understanding lead-based paint rules because different regulations will use these as their cutoff for when the rules apply. We'll go over that in more detail as we go, but 1960 and 1978 are key dates to be aware of. So under New York City's lead law, Local Law 1 of 2004, we have a very important concept to understand, which is the presumption of having lead-based paint. And what this concept means is that lead-based paint is so dangerous and it's so important to protect New York City residents from lead poisoning that the law presumes or assumes that paint is lead when certain conditions are met. So even if the paint can't be tested or hasn't been tested rather, the law requires HPD and requires building owners to assume that it's lead if, I'm going to go to point 2 here first, the building was built prior to January 1st, 1960, and the building is really anything other than a private dwelling where only the owner and their family lives. So almost all buildings, any multiple dwelling, meaning a building with 3 or more residential units, or any private dwelling, meaning a building with 1 or 2 residential units where a tenant lives in one of those units, Local Law 1 is going to apply. And again, if that building was built prior to 1960. You can also quickly mention that Local Law 1 is also going to come into play for buildings built between 1960, the date New York City banned lead-based paint, and 1978, the date the federal government banned lead-based paint, where the owner has actual knowledge of lead-based paint. That's a smaller category of buildings, but it is something to be aware of. And then many Local Law 1 provisions are triggered by the presence of a child. So the child must be under 6 years old, and the child must reside in a unit. And reside has been defined as living in the unit or routinely spending 10 or more hours per week. So this concept of reside is important to understand because in some cases, we might not say, or a tenant might not say that a child lives in a unit, but the child may still reside in that unit under local law 1. So for instance, a babysitter is babysitting a child 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. That would mean that the babysitter is babysitting that child 15 hours a week in their apartment. And so the child would be said to reside in that apartment, and all of the requirements of local law 1 that depend upon the presence of a child will come into play. But another thing that's important to understand about local law 1 is that just because there is lead-based paint in a building, or just because we presume that there is lead-based paint in a building, does not mean that an owner is in violation. It's not a violation just to have lead-based paint in a building. The violations are going to come in relating to different responsibilities, and particularly relating to lead-based paint hazards. So as long as lead-based paint is covered up under intact layers of non-lead-based paint, it is not considered to be an immediate danger. That non-lead paint is preventing the lead paint from turning into dust or paint chips and getting into the child's environment where it can harm them. So it's not considered an immediate danger. It's not a violation to have intact lead-based paint covered up under non-lead paint in units within your buildings. So there are a variety of ways that violations of the law can come up, but the two real concerns under the law are around paint that may be damaged, deteriorated, or disturbed, or paint that's on high-risk surfaces, especially what we call door and window friction surfaces. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And where a child can be affected. So those are the two general areas that the law looks at. Now, there are a lot of specific rules that revolve around these two factors, but those are the two main factors to be aware of. And when one or both of those factors are present, that's where violations may start to come into play. So what does local law 1 ask building owners to do specifically? Well, it asks them to be proactive in preventing lead-based paint hazards. Proactive is a word that means we don't wait. It's the opposite of reactive. Reactive would be a system where we wait until a child is poisoned, and only then do we respond to the building, and only then do we make fixes and make repairs to protect the child. And the Department of Health does play a role there, and they will respond if a child tests positive for elevated lead levels in their blood. But the law also expects owners to be proactive, to do everything they can to prevent that situation from happening in the first place. So to take actions before there is a problem, to prevent that problem from happening. So in all dwellings built before January 1st, 1960, again, that was the date that New York City banned lead-based paint, building owners have to do the annual inquiry. We'll talk more about this later. Find out if there are children under 6 living in any unit, and then find out whenever there is deteriorated paint in that unit and address the deteriorated paint issue. There are also several requirements under local law 1 that do not depend on the presence of a child. So there are requirements to do some more intensive work to address lead issues in units whenever an apartment is vacant. And there are requirements to ensure that whenever work is done that is going to disturb lead-based paint, that the contractors who do that work are certified with the proper licenses from the US Environmental Protection Agency, and that those contractors are using safe work practices. So again, these safe work practices and turnover requirements do not depend on the presence of a child. So for anybody who has joined us here today who doesn't have a child in their building, these provisions of the law will still apply to your building if local law 1 does apply to your building. Very quickly, we'll just mention that up until a few years ago, private dwellings, which again are defined as buildings with only 1 or 2 residential units, mostly were not covered under local law 1 except for a few provisions. But as of 2021, the requirements were expanded to apply to all private dwellings. Now, I won't go into too much detail here, but the main reason that we bring this up now is just for you to be aware that if you do happen to see the term multiple dwelling in relation to lead safety in New York City, that word has been redefined when it comes to lead safety to apply to both multiple and private dwellings, specifically private dwellings that have units that have a tenant. So if you do see the term multiple dwelling, again, you can rest assured that whatever rule you are reading relating to lead applies to private dwellings with tenant occupied units as well. So we've just reviewed a few of the factors that will cause local law 1 to apply in a building. And now we want to give you a chance to kind of do a self-assessment on, does local law 1 apply to the building that you own or manage? So I'm going to send out this poll and let's see where our audience is at. So our first question is, when was your building built? Okay, about 2/3 of us have voted here. I'll give people a little more time. We're at about 3/4. And I will close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see how everybody voted. All right, so 71% of us here have buildings built before January 1st, 1960. That means that local law 1 definitely applies in your building. Now, we have 9% of our audience for whom their building was built between 1960 and 1978. So that means their building was built after New York City banned lead-based paint, but before the US federal government banned lead-based paint. So for you folks, local law 1 is really only going to come into play in a very particular circumstance, which is if you have actual knowledge of lead-based paint in your building. So even though New York City banned lead-based paint in 1960, it was still possible for workers to drive to another municipality and buy lead-based paint and use it in New York City. But it is much rarer to find lead-based paint in those buildings. So your responsibilities will be significantly lessened regarding local law 1 unless you have actual knowledge of lead-based paint. Now, for 7% of our audience, your buildings were built after January 1st, 1978. So for you, the good news is that it's very, very unlikely that there's lead-based paint in your building, and the provisions of local law 1 are not going to apply in your building. So that's excellent news for those of you whose buildings were built after 1978. And so this is good information for everybody to keep in mind as we proceed to understand to what extent the local law 1 rules do apply to you. I'm going to ask one more question here that will also help determine whether local law 1 applies to your building. Give me 1 second to bring up our poll. Okay. Do you own or manage a multiple dwelling or a private dwelling with at least one tenant occupied unit? Again, a reminder that a multiple dwelling is a building with 3 or more units, and a private dwelling is a building with 1 or 2 units. Okay, the votes are coming in. About half of us have voted now. And about 2/3. All right, about 3/4 of us have voted, and I'm going to go ahead and close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see how everybody voted. Okay, so the vast majority of our audience owns or manages a type of building where local law 1 is going to apply if the age of the building also means local law 1 is applied. So in other words, if the building was built before 1960 or between 1960 and 78 with actual knowledge of lead-based paint. But I do want to mention to the 3% of you who responded that you are in a private dwelling that only has owner-occupied units, that these provisions of Local Law 1 are not going to apply to your building. You know, the annual inquiry, the only exception is going to be safe work practices, which we'll get to in a little bit. But most of these provisions will not apply to your building. Now, again, for that 3% of you, that does not mean that there's no lead in your building. There could still be lead based on the age of the building, but the city does not require you to take all of the proactive steps that it requires of other building owners. But we do encourage you to stick around to get a sense of what it will take to keep children who live or in or visit your building safe from the dangers of lead-based paint. So let's hide these results. And I did just want to clarify one thing that I had mentioned before. In our previous poll, I'll just go back for a second with the building built date. I was talking about Local Law 1. Now, there are federal safe work practices requirements that we're about to talk about that apply to all buildings built before 1978. So that's just one other thing for the folks with buildings built between 60 and 78 to keep in mind. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good sense of whether Local Law 1 applies in the building that you own or manage. And we always get this question at every webinar that we do, so we wanted to address it right up front. Usually once people realize that Local Law 1 applies in their building, they're starting to wonder if there's any way to lessen the requirements. And the question that we get a lot is from people who say, I'll read this question from the slide, my building was built before 1960, which means normally Local Law 1 will apply, but it was gut renovated, so I believe that there is no lead-based paint. Do the Local Law 1 responsibilities still apply to my building, including the turnover and the August 2025 testing requirements? And the answer to that question is a strong yes. The presumption of lead-based paint applies to all buildings that are built before 1960, even if you believe that there is no lead-based paint. So one factor here is to keep in mind that even for gut renovated buildings, some components like risers, window frames, door frames may still be reused. Radiators are another one. But you know, regardless of that concern, the way the law is written, it's the building built date that matters for the purposes of Local Law 1, not the date of the revised certificate of occupancy, not the date of any gut renovations that you may have records for, but the building built date is the only date that matters in terms of whether Local Law 1 applies. So we usually then get a follow-up question from building owners who tell us that they are sure that there's no lead-based paint in any unit in their building and asking if there's anything they can do to reduce their responsibilities. And so the answer to that is good news. It's yes. If there is no lead-based paint in your building, you can arrange for testing to prove that there is no lead-based paint present, and then you can apply for an exemption. We'll talk a little bit about exemptions at the end of this webinar. I will mention that our audience is very curious about exemptions. We'll only have a brief amount of time to talk about it today because this webinar focuses on all the responsibilities that owners have under the law. And we think it's important to understand what those responsibilities are so you can understand the meaning of being exempted from them. So for anyone who's really mostly interested in exemptions, I would direct you to our exemptions webinar. There's a recording of that on our website, and that's going to go into a lot of detail for you on how you can apply for an exemption. But we will get to some brief discussion of exemption at the end today. So again, even if your building was gut renovated, you are not exempt from the requirements of Local Law 1, but you can arrange for testing and provide records to HPD to apply for an exemption. And under that exemption, your responsibilities will be reduced. All right, at this point in the presentation, when folks are new to this topic, they're often starting to wonder how they can get started in, and how they can start thinking about working with the New York City lead law. So we want to highlight some affordable, easy steps that you can take to be proactive. We're going to talk about documenting the annual notice and investigation requirements. You can add the different deadlines for those requirements to your calendar. Communication is absolutely key. Let your tenants know that you care about protecting their children from the dangers of lead. When you sign a new lease with tenants, discuss with them how dangerous lead-based paint can be. This can cause permanent, lifelong impacts for their children, and make sure that tenants know that you care about fixing any lead hazards that exist in their units, and encourage tenants to contact you whenever there's peeling paint in an apartment with a child under 6. There is a required lease notice that should always be included whenever you are doing a lease signing that talks about lead-based paint safety rules. That is one of the handouts that we have attached to this webinar. One part of the responsibility of building owners and managers is to do visual inspections for peeling paint. We'll talk about this more in a bit, but a quick, easy step you can take is to find the Department of Housing and Urban Development's lead-based paint visual assessment training course. There is a link to that course on HPD's website. It's also easy to find using a quick Google search, and that's a 30 to 45-minute online training that will explain to you the basics of how to inspect for deteriorated lead-based paint in the buildings that you own or manage. Another piece of advice we always give is to keep in mind the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So addressing lead-based paint issues proactively will make the process much easier for you. It's actually required under New York City law to repaint apartments at least once every 3 years. That's normally not something our inspectors are going out of their way to check for, but regularly repainting an apartment is going to help ensure that paint is not deteriorating to the point where it could trigger any kind of danger for a child or a violation from HPD. But whenever there are leaks or mold or other conditions that disturb paint, take care of them quickly before the problem can worsen and cause additional damage. And basically to do all the maintenance possible to prevent paint from deteriorating, because again, the real danger to children comes once that paint has deteriorated. So to whatever extent you can prevent that danger, you want to do that, and that will make your lead situation in your building easier to manage. Now, when I talk about repainting apartments, I do want to mention if any sanding of the paint or scraping of paint is going to be done, then we do have to start thinking about safe work practices, which we will get to in a bit. Then safe work practices will apply. And make sure that your building is registered with HPD. Now, our audience here today, you all found this webinar because we sent an email to the address associated with your registration. So I think this group is pretty familiar with the importance of registering, but it bears repeating. By registering your building with HPD, we will be able to contact you when complaints are filed against your building, when violations are issued, and for a lot of other important reasons. It's also required to be registered to respond to HPD violations. And you'll receive bulletins such as the one that advertised this webinar. So registration is very important. If there's anybody in the audience who has not registered their building, we encourage you to. Registration is not required for certain private dwellings, but even if you realize it's not required for your private dwelling, we strongly advise registering so that you can hear from HPD in the case of any complaints or violations or any other reasons why we would need to contact you. Very quickly, we'll mention HPD's enforcement role. Our inspectors are always checking for peeling paint in buildings where local law 1 applies and in units where a child under 6 resides. And in addition, we are selecting buildings for audits and inspections to make sure that owners have records documenting their compliance with the annual investigation, record keeping, and turnover requirements. So that is where HPD comes into the picture. But again, all of these rules do apply for building owners, even if HPD hasn't selected your building for an audit or HPD hasn't visited your building. The expectation under the law is that owners will be following these rules regardless. All right, so that was our overview. I know that was a lot. Now we're going to go into a bit more detail about these topics here. And I see there are lots of questions coming in. I will mention to our chiefs, if there are any questions that you'd like to jump in and answer, feel free. For now, we're going to keep going, and we will get to some of your questions as we go. Let's talk about safe work practices. These are practices that protect workers and tenants from exposure to dangerous lead-contaminated materials when work is being done in a building that is going to disturb lead-based paint. And in order to perform safe work practices, the workers need proper certification from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Safe work practices are required in all buildings built before 1978. So again, for those of you with buildings built between 1960 and 78, Local Law 1 is only going to apply if you have actual knowledge of lead-based paint. But safe work practices are going to apply regardless, because the safe work practices rules also apply under federal law, and the federal cutoff is for 1978. Now, safe work practices are required for almost all work that is going to disturb lead-based paint. So for any work that disturbs more than 2 square feet or 10% of a small component of lead-based paint in a room. Now notice in the sentence here, it says either lead-based paint or paint of unknown lead content. So that means that if you have not tested that paint and your building was built before 1978, then you will have to presume that that paint has lead and observe safe work practices requirements. Now again, only certified professionals can perform safe work practices. As a building owner, you really have two options. You can either hire outside contractors with the proper EPA certifications, or you can get yourself and your building staff certified. You will have to get certified as both a firm and get certifications for the individual staff who will be doing the work. For those of you finding outside contractors, the EPA website has a search tool that you can use to locate a certified contractor. In addition, we do strongly recommend that whatever contractor you hire, you verify their credentials with EPA by searching the EPA website. So you'll want to make sure that, do a quick check to make sure your contractor is legitimate and has the appropriate certifications by checking on the EPA website. We'll just give you a brief tour of some things you should see when safe work practices are being followed. We should see signage warning any passersby that there is a lead renovation area happening and that there is lead dangers. So this sign needs to be prominently posted by the entrance to the work site. There may be different forms this sign can take, but it should provide a prominent warning not to enter unless authorized. We can see plastic sheeting examples here. The plastic sheeting is going to be placed down around the work site to ensure that any dust that is created is going to fall down onto the sheeting and not fall into the cracks between the floorboards or get into other hard to clean areas within the apartment. You're going to see wet methods. So whenever paint is being scraped, it should be spritzed down with water. That's going to cause the dust that is created from that scraping to become heavier, and it's going to fall down right onto that plastic sheeting, and it can be cleaned easily. Without wet methods, the dust is going to float around in the air, and it may take a long time to settle. It may settle even after the work site was cleaned. So we want to use wet methods in a safe work practices work site. And daily cleanup is something else you should see. And we'll show you a few things that should not be seen at a work site, which are open flame, burning or torching of paint, or the opposite of wet methods, dry scraping or sanding of paint. So as a building owner or manager, you are responsible for ensuring that safe work practices are being used at your building. So if you do observe that contractors are not following any of the 4 practices we mentioned on the previous slide, or you do see something like the practices being used on this slide, you should stop the work immediately and have a discussion with the contractor about the importance of following safe work practices and prevent any additional work from being done unless it's being done according to the protective requirements. Now, there's a second part of safe work practices. The first part is to make sure the work itself is done in a safe way that's not going to cause dust to spread. The second part is what we call clearance. And clearance means verifying that the work was done properly by testing surfaces in the apartment and making sure that they are free of dangerous lead dust. This is something a lot of people aren't aware of, and it's important to know even invisible amounts of lead-based paint dust can still be extremely toxic to a child. So if the work was not done safely, you could come into an apartment, the floors could be spotless and shiny from being mopped, but there could still be dangerous amounts of dust on those surfaces. And so the only way we know for sure that the site has been cleaned is by doing some testing. So we can see an example here on the right of dust wipe sample testing. You can see that this worker has placed a template on the floor. They are going to be wiping the area covered within that template with some wet wipes in a prescribed way. They're going to put the wipes in the vials that we see at the right of the picture, and those vials will be sent to a laboratory for testing to determine whether there is a dangerous amount of lead on that surface. And there are a number of required locations for doing these tests, not just on the floor, but also on windowsills and wells and in a few different locations on the floor. The concept of independence is very important for clearance. So the worker who conducts the clearance testing has to be independent from the firm that did the work itself. And the lab that does the testing also has to be independent from both of the workers who did the work and the person who's doing the dust wipe sampling. Tenants are not allowed to reoccupy an area until that area has passed these clearance tests. Otherwise, those tenants are going to be at risk. So this is another important step relating to safe work practices. Okay, let's talk about a few other responsibilities now. Annual notice and record keeping. Now we're going to talk about these together because this is an excerpt from a separate webinar where we talk about annual notice and record keeping together. They go well together as topics. And if you're interested in learning more about either of these, I'd refer you to that webinar where we go into a lot of detail. Let's talk about record keeping. The law requires building owners to keep records of all lead-based paint activities for at least 10 years. Just as an additional note for you private dwelling owners, the turnover requirements have always applied in private dwellings ever since Local Law 1 was passed in 2004. So your building should have records of compliance with turnover requirements dating back to 10 years at this point, even though the other provisions of Local Law 1 were only recently expanded to your buildings. And these records have to be detailed. Owners are expected to keep detailed written records step by step for each step of each procedure. Again, in our annual notice and record keeping webinar, we show what that would look like step by step as you go through every bit of the annual notice process. But it's not as simple as, you know, a quick checklist. Did annual notice this year? Check. No, you'll need to keep records of every inquiry you sent, every response you did or didn't receive, every follow-up attempt you made, and so on and so forth. We recommend that you keep in mind that these records are designed to be shared, so you want to keep them in such a way that they will be easy to share. So imagine someone else reading your records. That could be HPD or another agency that may audit or request the records, or it could be another building owner. If the building is sold, the seller must provide the records to the buyer. If the seller does not have the records, there is a process that the buyer can take of filling out an affidavit with HPD. You could call our lead unit for more information about that if needed, but it's much better to simply have the records. We recommend that you keep all of these records organized in one place. So an analogy I like to use is pocket change. If I have some pocket change in my apartment that I want to spend, it's helpful if it's all in a jar where I've been putting it. If it's all in my apartment, but it's all spread around under my couch cushions and hidden in different places, then it's not going to be convenient for me if I need to spend that pocket change, because I'm going to need to spend time collecting it. So the same thing can be true of lead records. If you are doing any lead-based paint related work in a unit of your building, you may wish to make 2 copies of the records of that work, 1 copy to go in the file for that unit, perhaps, and another copy to go in a separate file where you keep records of all lead-based paint activities, so that again, if you need to provide these records, that you can do so easily. And again, just keep in mind that anyone should be able to read your records and understand what they mean. So annual notice is a great example of a kind of responsibility that building owners need to keep records for. A lot of us in New York are familiar with this annual notice process. So every year, building owners have to ask about the presence of children under 6 residing in units in their building. Where there's a child under 6, follow up by doing a visual inspection for deteriorated paint. And wherever deteriorated paint is found, then building owners should follow up by hiring certified contractors to address those hazards. Now, just as a quick aside, the annual inquiry isn't the only time you may have to do this process of inspection, identification, and follow-up. Any other time as a building owner, you learn that paint in an apartment with a child under 6 residing may have been damaged, you should follow up with the inspection, identification of hazards, and addressing those hazards. So might not be the annual inquiry. It could also be a complaint from a tenant or to 311. It could be a violation issued by HPD. Could be you learn of a leak, etc. We'll also mention that the same process of inspection, identifying the hazard, and responding is required at vacancy. We'll go into that a little more in a bit, and there are a few additional steps required at vacancy beyond just the inspection and identification of deteriorated paint. So there are some deadlines associated with the annual notice process. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but what you can see here is that this process is very carefully set out by law. It's not a particularly flexible process. So there's a deadline for completing the annual inquiry. There's a deadline for tenants to respond. There's a deadline for the owner to follow up by checking at units that didn't respond and trying to get an answer. You have to notify the Department of Health of any units where the presence of a child could not be determined, and so forth. And inspection results must be shared with all tenants. So if you're interested in learning more about this, you can take a look at our annual notice webinar, but there are a lot of very specific formal steps that must be followed as part of this annual notice process. In order to keep records of processes like annual notice, HPD offers some sample forms. This is an example of a sample form. This example is available on our website. And our webinar gives some examples of how you can fill these sample forms out. Now, in order to use these forms, you do have to understand the rules. They aren't quite as simple as, say, like a 1040 easy tax form where it's going to tell you to fill out section 1 and then go to section 2 and lay everything out for you. You do have to apply your own judgment and knowledge here. But these forms are a great resource for you. They're not required, but if anybody's wondering how to get started on record keeping, we strongly recommend using these forms. They should be very helpful for you. Let's take another poll and do some quick review here. This was mentioned a few times, but when does a child reside in the unit? And this definition will apply when you're doing your annual investigation and apply in general for the purposes of determining whether local law 1 provisions apply in your unit. Okay, I see some 20% of the votes are coming in. About half of us have voted here. Okay, I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds and close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see how everybody voted. Okay, so the answer we were looking for is lives in or routinely spends 10+ hours per week. But the really important thing is to understand about this 10+ hours per week requirement. So when you're talking to your tenants, we do recommend not just asking them, does a child live in the apartment, but ask them, does a child spend time in the apartment? In many cases, tenants may say no if you ask them if a child lives in the apartment, but if you ask them if a child spends time in the apartment, they may tell you yes, and then mention the child that they babysit or the child who regularly visits, etc. Okay, let's talk about what to do when when units within a building are vacant. Again, we have an entire separate webinar that goes into more detail on this topic. And the time when a unit is vacant is called turnover. New York City's lead law focuses on turnover because it's considered to be an excellent time to take some steps to keep tenants safe from lead-based paint. During turnover, there's no need to coordinate access with tenants, and there's no risk of exposing tenants to lead-based paint dust during any work that's being done. So the idea is that over time, these turnover requirements will reduce lead-based paint hazards in all apartments throughout New York City as owners follow those turnover requirements at the next vacancy. Now, just like safe work practices, turnover requirements apply. This is the first point on our slide here. Turnover requirements apply whether or not a child under 6 is moving out of the apartment or moving into the apartment. So a lot of times we will have building owners attend our webinars and ask the question, they'll say, I know that there are no children living in my building right now. Do I have to worry about these lead laws? And the answer is yes. The safe work practices requirements apply whether or not there is a child living in the building, and these turnover requirements also apply whether or not the child is living in the building, as well as the testing requirement that we're going to talk about in a second. Now, the turnover requirements also go beyond checking for deteriorated paint. These requirements are going to require owners to do work on certain high-risk surfaces, even if that paint is not deteriorated. And those high-risk surfaces are door and window friction surfaces. We can talk about that a little more in a bit. But basically, mostly under Local Law 1, as we've seen, for instance, with the annual investigation, you are checking an apartment for deteriorated paint. But here at vacancy, even if there's no deteriorated paint, you have to take steps to abate door and window friction surfaces. Another quick note is that, again, the turnover requirements always applied in private dwellings even before 2021. So private dwellings should have been following these turnover rules since Local Law 1 passed in 2004. Now, what must be done during turnover? I'll talk first about stabilization. Stabilization is really, this is the kind of work that you would do during the annual inspection and investigation and response, or any other time that you learn that there is deteriorated lead-based paint in a unit. Generally, the response is going to be stabilization. This is something that temporarily addresses the lead-based paint problem. So it's not a permanent solution, but it stabilizes the paint. The best example of this would be if there's some deteriorated paint, following safe work practices, scraping that paint down to a smooth surface and then painting over it. So this work has to be done every time an apartment changes tenancy. And this is only required for surfaces with deteriorated paint. It requires what's called an RRP license from the EPA, renovation, repair, and painting. The other kind of work required at turnover is abatement. This is the work that's required for your door and window friction surfaces. So abatement is defined as practices that permanently eliminate lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. And so this abatement must be done only once. So Local Law 1 was passed in 2004, or actually it took effect in 2004, I should say. And so this abatement of door and window friction surfaces is intended to be a permanent solution. That means it only should have been done or needs to have been done once after 2004. So for any units where it hasn't been done yet, it should be done at the next vacancy. And this is required, again, for door and window friction surfaces, even if those surfaces don't have any deteriorated paint. In fact, door and window friction surfaces, these are the parts of a door and window that rub against each other. Often that rubbing process can make that surface appear nice and smooth and polished. But the reason why it will have that polished appearance is actually because microscopic amounts of dust are being released into that apartment. So that's actually an indication that some lead dust may have been created by this rubbing. So this is why during the opportune time of vacancy, the law requires building owners to do this abatement. And abatement requires a different kind of EPA license, an abatement license. And as always, all work that disturbs lead-based paint must be done using safe work practices, and clearance must be performed. By the way, the license required for dust wipe clearance is, again, an EPA license of either inspector or risk assessor. What's the deadline for turnover work? Just before the next tenant moves in. That's the only deadline. As long as the apartment's vacant, the deadline hasn't expired yet. And just as an added note of interest, when you provide that required lead-based paint notice to tenants during lease signing, as a building owner or manager, you are actually certifying that you have done this turnover work as required. Okay, we're going to cover a few other topics quickly here. Local Law 31 of 2020 requires building owners to arrange for testing of all rental units for the presence of lead-based paint, either by August 2025, or if a child under 6 comes to reside in the unit within 1 year of when the child came to reside. So whichever is sooner, August 2025 or within 1 year of when the child came to reside. This testing has to be done by an independent contractor. So as an owner, you cannot do this testing yourself. This is a good time to mention, by the way, that when we're talking about complying with Local Law 1, testing should be done by someone with a certification. There are home lead tests available at hardware stores, things like that, and it doesn't hurt to use those tests. You're free to use them if you think it might give you a sense of whether there's lead in a particular unit, but that does not constitute testing as far as Local Law 1 is concerned. You know, that's just something extra you might do if you think it's helpful, but that kind of testing will not allow you to say for certain whether there's lead-based paint on the surface. In order to do that, you'll need to get a certified contractor. Now, the good news about this provision is that testing is the key first step in getting an exemption. So you're already going to have all of your testing results queued up and ready in the process of complying with this Local Law 131 of 2020, and that's going to set you up very nicely to make an assessment of applying for exemptions in the units in the buildings that you own or manage. A quick piece of discussion around recent news. As of December 1st, 2021, the threshold defining lead-based paint under New York City's law was cut in half, from 1.0 milligrams of lead per square centimeter to 0.5 milligrams of lead per square centimeter. So this is a few years ago at this point. We're still mentioning it just to explain that if you happen to see the term 1.0 milligrams of lead floating around anywhere, that is now out of date as far as New York City's rules are concerned. And any contractor you hire to do testing for the presence of lead-based paint on a painted surface should be using one of the 3 approved XRF analyzers that are able to test at this new strict threshold. And those are the Viken Detection Model PB200I or Model PB200E, and the SciAps Model X550. So your contractors who do testing should be familiar with these. If they aren't, that's a sign that they're probably not a responsible contractor. And you'll want to make sure that they're testing at this new threshold. If you are a building owner or manager who has old test results that were conducted at the old threshold, those test results really can't be used for much going forward. They no longer constitute proof of whether a surface contains lead-based paint or not. So even if the results might say that the concentration of lead was, for instance, 0.3 milligrams per centimeter squared. So the results might say that it was below the new threshold of 0.5. Those results were created by a machine that was not properly calibrated for our new threshold. So the short way of explaining this is that old test results prior to the passage of this new threshold can't be used going forward, except for showing that you tested all units by 2025 as required by the testing law. So in that case, you will get credit for having arranged the testing, but you won't actually be able to use the test results for anything going forward. All right, we're going to quickly talk about violations. Hopefully, all of you, by attending this webinar and being communicating well with tenants, being aware of these issues, you can avoid receiving violations, but it's not always possible to prevent. So just to understand a bit about HPD violations and HPD's role in all of this. One thing to know is that HPD inspectors are always checking for the presence of children under 6 and the presence of deteriorated lead-based paint in any apartment they go to where the building was built before 1960, or if HPD has knowledge that there's lead-based paint in the building and it was built between 1960 and 1978. So even if the tenant did not complain about a lead-based paint issue, our inspectors are checking. And whenever there is a child under 6 and deteriorated paint, HPD will be treating that as a lead issue. HPD inspectors are going to issue a violation when there's a child under 6 residing in the unit, when there is deteriorated paint, and when HPD has either identified or must presume that there is lead-based paint. So HPD inspectors will always try to test the painted surface with an XRF analyzer to confirm whether there is lead in that surface. But if the inspectors cannot gain access to the apartment to test, they will presume that the paint is lead-based based on the requirements of the law, which requires HPD to presume in buildings built before 1960 that there is lead. This is an example of a notice of violation for a lead-based paint condition. It's a good time to remind everybody, register your property so that you hear from us and you receive these letters when any kind of violation is issued. And there will be some important deadlines and instructions visible on the notice of violation. So we might as, oops, skipped a slide there. We'll just reinforce this with a quick reminder and a poll. This will be our last poll of the presentation. So let us know, are the buildings you own or manage currently registered with HPD? I see about half of us have voted. Give it maybe 10 more seconds. And I'll close the polls in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and that is great. 91% of you are registered. That's as we expected, because that's how we got in touch with most of you to attend this webinar. Now, 4% are registered but need to update their contact information. So that's a good thing for you to be aware of. Sometimes we will find that building owners are aware of the registration requirement, but when they have staff changes, they'll forget to update the contact information. So this is a good reminder to go ahead and contact our registration unit to update your contact information anytime your staff changes. And 1% of the audience have not registered your building. So we do recommend, unless it's an owner-occupied private dwelling and there are no tenants, we recommend that you register, even where it may not be required, because that's how you will hear from us about things like lead-based paint violations from your tenants. Okay. Now, if you do receive a lead-based paint violation from HPD, the first thing to understand is that removing these violations can be a complicated process, because HPD needs to request much more documentation to clear these violations than we do for other kinds of violations. And that's because of all of those safe work practices requirements and certifications that the workers need to have. So we have an entire webinar just on responding to HPD violations. My advice to you is, if you were to receive an HPD lead-based paint violation and weren't sure how to respond, to go ahead and take a look at that violations webinar to get yourself started. Also, all HPD lead-based paint violations must be re-inspected in order to be cleared. Quick other thing to mention is that another New York City agency also plays a role in lead-based paint safety, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I had mentioned this a bit earlier, they are the agency that's going to react if a child tests positive for elevated levels of lead in their blood. And they're going to respond to the child's family and may investigate a number of different parts of the child's environment. So not necessarily just their apartment, but also their school, their daycare, a playground where they spend time, etc. And if the Department of Health finds lead-based paint in the child's apartment, then that matter is going to be referred to HPD as well. HPD is going to do an audit of the building's records and try to inspect all apartments with a child under 6. You see here a picture of a stamp that says lead-based paint. That is the stamp that the Department of Health uses when they identify lead-based paint on a surface. It's just another thing to be aware of, another piece of the puzzle of lead-based paint enforcement in New York City. Now, by this time in our webinar, a lot of people are thinking very carefully about exemption because you're aware of how detailed these requirements are and you're interested in exploring ways to lessen your responsibilities while still keeping your tenants safe. So exemption is a process whereby you can show HPD records of testing results and work done in units that you own or manage, and you can either eliminate or reduce certain requirements under the law. For instance, avoid doing the annual notice and investigation every year. There are 2 kinds of exemption. One is called lead-free. In that exemption, you simply demonstrate that there is no lead-based paint in a particular unit. There's another kind of exemption called lead-safe, where you would demonstrate that there may be some lead-based paint in the unit, but that lead-based paint has been made safe through approved work methods. So those 2 kinds of exemption have different levels of benefits. And to understand more about that, again, take a look at our exemption webinar. And again, as you comply with this requirement to test all units before August of 2025, as those test results come in, take a look at those results and you can do an assessment of which units you can pursue an exemption for based upon those results. One thing to be aware of for any of our audience who may currently have an HPD exemption, that is because of that threshold change that I had mentioned previously, old exemptions are going to be revoked at the next time the apartment becomes vacant or at the next turnover. So any exemption that was done based on testing at that old 1.0 milligrams per centimeter square threshold, those exemptions will remain active, but only until the next turnover. So for people who are interested in exemptions, again, we have that webinar, and we also did attach an FAQ document, frequently asked questions about exemption, to the handouts for this webinar. And that document is available on our website as well as that exemptions webinar. Okay, that concludes the main portion of our talk. I'm going to quickly show some resources to learn more, and then we will get into answering questions from you, our audience. HPD's website, nyc.gov/HPD, has a lot of helpful resources for you. You can look up your building using HPD Online and see a list of open complaints and much more. If you want to learn more about registering your property, for those of you who need to update your contact information or need to go ahead and register, that's available, as well as detailed information about HPD safety requirements and a link to the ABCs of housing. Now, the ABCs of housing is a document that I'll bring this up on the screen very quickly here. For anybody who's really feeling overwhelmed with getting to understand HPD's requirements, ABCs of housing is a great place for you to start. This is the single best introduction to HPD and housing safety that I can think of, so I would direct you there. And it has an explanation of a lot of different rules that HPD enforces, as well as contact information for different organizations and units within and outside of HPD who may be able to help you as you get up to speed on all of HPD's rules and regulations. On our lead-based paint page, nyc.gov/lead-based-paint, we have all these webinars I keep mentioning to you available to watch, as well as much more information. That's a great place to visit to learn more about all of this. Now, we're about to open things up for questions, but I do want to mention if you have a question about a specific situation for your building, you should contact HPD's lead-based paint unit at 212-863-5501. Again, 212-863-5501. We won't be able to go into your specific situation today, so we'll only be able to answer more general types of questions. So we recommend reaching out to the lead unit for answers to your specific questions. And again, there's much more, and stay tuned for additional webinars to come. And if you can take a moment, let us know what, after we end the webinar, what you thought of how we did, what we can improve on, what you liked about this webinar. And again, you'll receive an email with a link to video of this recording within about 24 hours. And we will also be posting that video on our website within the week. Okay, it is time for questions and answers with our guests. I'll turn it over to Jesse. Jesse, what questions have we seen come in that we'll address with our chiefs here?
Hi, thank you, Phil. And I'll also open it up to the chiefs if they've got any questions that they would like to address if they've seen any. But we'll start with Chief Wyndham. If an XRF report indicates that a surface tested positive, but the surface is intact and there's no peeling paint, what needs to be done? Is there any work or dust wipe that needs to be done with that kind of condition?
Yes, Jesse. Unfortunately, the surface would still need to be abated. I think you said the surface tested positive, but the surface was intact.
Is intact, yes.
Yes, if that's
no,
the
no peeling paint.
Oh, okay. If there's no peeling paint, then the surface is not creating a lead hazard risk. So that surface is intact, and it will be deemed adequate.
And if I may add to that, Jesse, if it's for
Sure.
a friction surface, right, it needs to be abated the next turnover.
Okay, and can you, thank you, Chief Ayub. Can you give just a couple quick examples of what a friction surface might be, just to clarify?
Friction surface are usually the door itself and the door jamb or the door casing. For windows, it will be the actual window sash and the two jambs where the window rub against as it slides up and down. So that will be the right jamb and the left jamb. Those are considered friction surface on the window. An apron, a windowsill, and the window casing are not considered friction surfaces.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a number of questions as they anticipated about gut renovation. So we already addressed that. I'll just mention, since a few of them came in the flavor of, does a gut renovation change the year built? And that answer is generally going to be no. If, Department of Building, Certificate of Occupancy, that paperwork still has a year built, all the records still has a year built. Gut renovation doesn't really change that. So the year built is the year built, regardless of what goes on these inside surfaces. So again, gut renovation testing and exemption is what you're going to want to explore if you're looking to show that you might want to reduce the requirements under Local Law 1. All right. We had a question come in from Robert. How do I engage a certified inspector to inspect my building? Where do I access a list of any of these, of any approved vendors? Can I throw that one to Chief Ayub?
Unfortunately, HPD cannot give out a list of certified vendors. However, management is more than welcome to go to the EPA website. EPA website does have a listing of vendors in your area. You put in your zip code and you get to choose which vendors are certified.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a question from Jessica. Are there kits so we can test ourselves? So do lead testing yourself rather than engaging with a company. Chief Wyndham, can can a building owner or manager go out to a hardware store and buy one of those lead test kits and satisfy the requirements of local law 1 using that?
Yes, Jesse, I think Phil mentioned this earlier.
Mhm.
There are kits available for landlords and owners to purchase to test and get an idea of if a surface contains lead-based paint. However, those kits will not suffice pertaining to our requirements at HPD. They will have to use an EPA certified contractor to test the surfaces to be provided to cure our violations.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'll jump in with a question we see here from David. I'll throw this one to Chief Ayoub. If units are occupied by adults only, with no children, do I still need to do the lead test by August 2025? And if yes, what actions am I required to take if the test is positive? And how can I correct the problem while tenants are still living there?
Unfortunately, the law required that all rental units be tested by 2025. So if there are no children there, by law, you still need to test that apartment by 2025. Does that answer the question? So,
Yes, and so it does. And as the follow-up part of that question, if there's no children in the apartment, and let's say that there are positive tests for lead, but no children, does the owner have to take any additional steps just based on those positive tests?
under local law 1, if the tests are positive on friction surfaces, then those components need to be abated at the next turnover. However, since there's no child there will not be any local law 1 hazard because a child has to be under 6 in resident. Regardless of that fact, I'll highly recommend that the area still be remedy of the hazard.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. And David, I think part of the answer here is that it takes a little while to get up to speed with lead because there are a lot of specific different requirements under the law that each come into play based on additional circumstances. So some of the requirements that we discussed, for instance, the annual inspection, are triggered by the presence of a child. But we also discussed how the testing requirement does not depend on the presence of a child, nor do the safe work practices requirements or the abatement at turnover requirement. So to fully understand what is needed, you'll just kind of have to go through each of these requirements and analyze each of them in turn. But as we said at the very beginning of the presentation, simply having intact lead-based paint in on a surface in a building that you own or manage is not necessarily a violation in itself. The issues are going to come in under specific circumstances as we sort of outlined throughout the presentation.
Phil, I saw a question here I'd like to answer in regards to shareholders of either condo or a co-op unit. In fact, I saw several questions. For everyone, please bear in mind, for shareholder and records or their family, if they reside in the unit, then local law 1 does not apply. Local law 1 apply to those units when the units are being rented.
Okay, thank you, Chief. And just to confirm, does that include local law 31, the testing law as well?
Yes, let's only go into effect when the units are being rented.
Okay. And now just to remind everybody, just because local law 1 does not apply, that does not necessarily mean that your building is free of lead-based paint hazards. It just means that the law is not requiring you to take these specific prescribed steps to address those hazards. But we do encourage you to remain aware of the danger of lead-based paint for any children who may be living in your buildings, and take your own actions as you deem appropriate to protect children who may be living in your condos or co-ops. Jesse, other questions that have come in?
Yes, this one, it was mentioned a number of times, but we have a bunch of questions about a bunch of these types of questions. So if a building was built in this example, 1990, anything after 1978, does any of this apply to the building? So I'll throw this to the chiefs. If the building was built after 1978, does any of what we discussed apply to that building?
No,
Jesse?
no, Jesse. If a building is built after January 1st, 1978, then those buildings are exempt from local law 1.
Okay, great, thank you. In the context of what I assume the annual notice and annual inspection requirements, if it's difficult to get cooperation with a tenant to inspect a unit or inspect all the rooms, what should the owner do in those cases? I'll send this one to Chief Wyndham.
Jesse, I'll take that one, Jesse. In
Okay.
that case, when the tenants are not cooperating, the management will document that and then send a letter to DOH instructing them as such.
Okay, so just documenting their efforts and making sure to notify Department of Health.
Yes, that they were not able to access the unit.
Great, thanks.
Another question for Chief Ayub from Robert. Do these rules apply to the common areas of the building, aka stairwells, or are there different reporting requirements for the common areas?
Under local law 1, if a child resides in the building, then the common area needs to be also applicable to local law 1.
Okay, thank you, Chief. So
Meaning safe work practice have to be done in the common area.
Okay, thank you. Safe work practices, the annual investigation as well must be done in common areas, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but of course, turnover, that's not going to apply for a common area because the concept of vacancy doesn't apply.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Jesse, maybe one or two more questions?
Yep. If a building was built before 1968, therefore it's presumed to have lead, but there's no peeling paint, there's no paint exposed, do you still have to do the lead testing by 2025? So if there's no peeling paint.
Yes, Jesse, they're still required to do the lead testing by 2025.
Thank you, Chief. And just a quick note that the question used 1968 as a cutoff date, but the two dates that we're concerned about are 1960, which is the date that New York City banned lead-based paint in residential housing, and then
I'll take that one.
1978.
Yeah,
Um,
between
yeah,
1960 and 1978, the law will only apply if the owner is aware of lead-based paint being used in their building. So if the owner have no knowledge of actual lead-based paint being used in the building, then the law does not apply to building built between 1960 and 1977.
Thank you, Chief Ayub. I was just going to mention as well, just to reinforce what Chief Wyndham said, this testing requirement is required for all units, regardless of any indication of either presence of a child or deteriorated paint. The idea of this law is to give you a comprehensive knowledge of where surfaces in your building have lead so that you can be informed as you move forward.
I have another question about the annual notice, that if a child now resides in a unit, can you confirm that I now have to do the notice and inspection and record keeping until they move out?
Regardless of the presence of a child, the annual notice have to be sent out every single year. That is the law and it's a requirement.
Yeah, I think that that it bears repeating, emphasizing that the annual notice is the official process to determine where a child lives. Maybe a child comes to reside in a unit and the owner's not made aware. The annual notice is that official process to regularly check if a child is there. So yeah, that's gonna have to go on for all the rental units. And then if a child is found to reside there, then there's additional requirements that are needed.
I think this is a point that bears emphasizing because it can take some getting used to, that these lead rules are very particular in how they expect owners to keep tenants safe. So with the example of the annual investigation, many owners may feel that they have a sense of which tenants are living in which units. You may think that you already know where children are present in your buildings. You may actually already know, but the law still requires you to make the formal official inquiry every year and to follow and observe all of the deadlines and dates that are provided. So, you know, even if you had been on the phone with the tenants in December of that year and asked them if they have a child under 6 and they say no, you will still have to send that notice out to the tenant. You know, you'll still have to follow all of the inquiry process as prescribed by law. And the same thing goes for all of the other provisions in the law. They are very particular, and you want to be sure to follow the letter of these laws as well as the spirit and follow all of those particulars. Okay, I think we have time for one more question and then we will wrap up. Jesse, any questions pop out at you?
Let's see here. We have a 3-family house and it's occupied by owners. We also don't have any children. Our house was built in the 1930s. We had a gut renovation. Are they still subject to the annual lead inspection? So assuming that all the units are occupied by owners.
Local law will not apply for any unit that's occupied by owners or their immediate family. So in this case, it's a 3-family house. If the owner live in one and the immediate family live in the other 2 apartments, then they will not have to send out the annual notice.
Okay, and if a family member moves out and they end up renting to a non-family member, in that case, what will they have to do?
They will have to send it out every year going forward for that particular unit that's been rented.
Okay, great, thank you. Phil, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you to both of our chiefs, and thank you, Jesse. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Just we apologize that we couldn't get to all of your questions. There are a lot of questions that have come in about sort of when is local law 1 going to apply based on testing results, based on the presence of a child, based on whether paint is deteriorated. And the truth about local law 1 is that to really understand when it applies, you need to learn it pretty well. So there are a number of different provisions, each of which have different factors that will cause them to come into play, depending on the date that the building was built, depending on the presence of a child in some but not all cases, depending on the results of your testing. Keep in mind, it's not necessarily a violation to have lead-based paint on a painted surface, but violations are going to come in based on different kinds of scenarios, and requirements to do abatement and other kinds of work will come in depending on additional scenarios. So I would recommend rewatching the webinar, familiarizing yourself more with the rules in order to get up to speed on exactly what the requirements are going to be in your particular situation. And again, the lead-based paint unit is available for you as a resource as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and conclude our webinar. Thanks so much, everybody, for taking the time to join us and learn what is required under the law to keep your tenants safe from lead-based paint hazards. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great afternoon.